Hello, welcome to Outlawed Thoughts episode 64. I'm here with a special guest. We've got Shane Cashman. I reached out to you on Twitter just recently, so this was sort of a pretty quick turnaround. Normally, it takes a while for me to get replies back from people. So,
I'm fast. I'm fast, man. I appreciate the message.
and I was watching clips on your Twitter just yesterday of all the stuff you've been doing recently. You've been making the rounds.
Yeah. It's
Definitely,
been fun.
which is always good. That's the way to do it.
Yep.
I saw you were in with like the Infowars guys and stuff. Like
Yeah.
just a little while back. That's like
Yeah.
cool and
That
that's
was crazy. I went down to Texas to write a story about Alex Jones. So him and I had done the culture war with Tim Pool
right.
back in Austin. That must have been, I don't remember at this point, a few months ago maybe. And when we were down there, Alex and I kind of hung out. That was like the second or third time we had met, and I was just like, I need to write a story on Alex. So we set that up, and yeah, that story should come out tomorrow or the day after. But I was down there just writing a story, and Alex said, uh, "You should just do the Infowars show." So I hopped on, and then I finished the interview on his show. It was crazy.
She's saying
Is
my
my audio
audio
is
might
my
be
audio
different.
crazy?
I hear you fine, so I'm assuming it's mine. I just tried to jack mine up, but I see my audio levels are low. I'm not sure why. But
Shit.
yeah. I'm gonna fix it here on the fly while I'm going.
Well, yeah. So
uh
yeah, that story should come out. I think tomorrow is coming out. That was fun. That was crazy. I've been listening to Alex since I was like 18, so it was an honor.
okay, I just switched my audio input, so I'm not sure if that'll fix.
Let
I'm
us
just
know. Let us know if I still sound like
yeah.
if I sound like trash.
But yeah, so it's I did I was that's crazy getting to like that opportunity to go in that area too. That getting to write something like that and actually have access to talk to the person like
Yeah.
there's a lot of people on the in that space who just never get that opportunity, so it's sort of that to me is always cool getting
I've
okay,
been
Benzo says yep
trespassing.
better, so
Well, good looks, Ben. So I've been to these weird places. You, with Carrie Lake during her election trial, or with right after the Infowars thing, which is funny to be on. And day, it was Kanye's birthday, and I was hilarious talking to Alex about that whole situation. Yeah, scarred him. It was funny to think of Alex type of trauma from his own show. But
right. Yeah, oh, I think maybe that was okay. No, it was my internet stuff on my end. It's
oh,
stupid
cool,
stuff popped up. It's
cool,
it's
cool.
always when I start a stream that I have all these problems, of course. um no, so it yeah, I mean like I my focus recently, like I do a little bit of writing for like script stuff, not really like publishing stuff, although there is I'm now going through the process of taking a lot of my script stuff and turning it into something that I could put up on a site or put up
Cool.
on like Substack, something along those lines. And most of it's about like Alaskan topics from back in the political days of the state when it was sort of statehood era in the
Yeah.
50s. But I did a documentary and I'm sort of working on doing a bigger project on this character named Joe Vogler, and sort of like this mindset of like I can imagine what it would be like to actually have that guy there for me to talk to, and sort of like so it's
Yeah.
like you think about those things, and so it's like having
It
the opportunity to do
changes
that is huge.
everything. Yeah, I mean, I could certainly sit back. I've done that before on people from like the past. I wrote a book about the Civil War, and a lot of people. So it's like you're relying on piling from book love letters that people wrote, and I spent like a year writing a book like that type of writing, because you're just laying through libraries. I'm traveling to Georgia. I'm trying to send in to people to see if they have to find suicide notes from people who are. So you kind of like Vogler, making like I'm assuming like someone you'll never meet, and then stuff I've been doing recently, and so that direct person, and so I'm cutting out. Ah, so I'm in my underground bunker
I
with.
don't know.
Uh,
Yeah, there's not an easy solution to that one.
sorry, guys. Sorry, I'll blame my.
it,
I'm in
it,
an underground.
it it's not the end of the world. I can record skipping. Benzo's normally in the chat, so she's sort of she definitely isn't. I can notice it on my end now. It's sort of choppy, so I do notice it, but it's not. It'll probably be an internet thing. So it was fine a second ago, so hopefully it'll get better.
Yep. I
But
just blame the
yeah,
CIA. It's the CIA sending things in.
yeah, that's sort of where a lot of this stuff with the state up here comes from. It's like you have this there's not a lot of attention in the writing area and like that stuff with the state outside of like mystery stuff. Like there's tons of that,
Yep.
like the kind of like, oh hey, there's like random deaths and things in Alaska that happen. And you'll get a lot of books written about like tourism and stuff in this area, but you don't get a lot of like, yeah, we've had like a bunch of senators who died and like a lot of like political
That's
people
weird.
who disappeared, like a lot of weird things that keep going on in the state consistently.
Huh.
Vogler being one of them. His story is in a nutshell is he came here in the 40s, in 1942 during the war. He had gotten fired from his job. He had passed the bar in Kansas, and he had went to Texas to get work. And he got fired in Texas because he made comments about FDR. He called him a communist bastard, and his boss in Texas didn't like it and fired him. And he went to Alaska because he was like, World War II's happening. There's all this shit going on, like politically, and he didn't really agree with it. He wasn't a big fan of like the government, so he took off.
Right.
Ended up in Fairbanks, and like by the 70s, he had gotten over 300 acres of land and was operating a mine for gold and
That's the
doing
dream.
yeah, and he was like doing property development, built like rental units and things like that up there in Fairbanks, and the state and the federal government at that point were sort of trying to push miners out and push that sort of culture out of the state, and so he
Right.
sort of took up the battle against that in the early 70s and led into 74. He created this thing called the Alaska Independence Party, which, because he was a lawyer, he was not making sort of a secessionist argument. He made a legal argument that the state, when it was made a state, was not given the proper options compared to everywhere else. That Hawaii and Alaska had basically gotten shafted in the mix of statehoods.
Right.
And so he creates this party. He gets 15,000 signatures and ends up like going on and on and on to build the whole thing up. But by the 90s, they ended up winning the governor's race here. So this guy named Walter Hickel wins the governor's race in Alaska, and that dude's a member of the AIP. He's not a Republican or a Democrat. He's a third-party candidate who won the actual governor's race. And
Right.
while this is happening, Vogler had submitted documents to the UN, and he had made an argument to the UN that they should actually intervene in the case of Alaska's statehood, because technically speaking, it was a territory, and they were
Right.
supposed to be the ones that were purveying over it, and so that was his legal argument. And it sort of dead ended because you had to get a co-sponsor for a UN bill,
Right.
or for the to get to go speak or whatever it was. I have the whole writing and stuff, but off the top of my head, it's been a while.
Right.
And then he like a week after he had resubmitted some things, he got reached out to right after the election in Iran by Ali Khamenei about
Wow.
sponsoring this UN speech. And so he like announced to a bunch of the political people around Alaska and the AIP guys locally in his area that he was going to be going to New York and talk at the UN and talk about Alaskan independence and stuff. And then like 3 days before his like set leave time that he had told people, he went missing, and then he was found dead after a bunch of random complications. He
Huh.
had been shot, and it turned out that this guy named Manfred West goes to prison for the murder, but there's a lot of problems with it because, well, to put it in the words of Jack Coghill, who's probably one of the most revered politicians in Alaska, and who was a lieutenant governor here, it was the cleanest extraction of any person anyone had ever seen. There was no evidence left behind. There was no anything. The cops had the shoddiest investigation on the planet. It was a normal just fuck job.
Wow.
And so, that's sort of where I covered his stuff, was going like, this kind of seems like weird. And then, Alaska's also home to people like Schaefer Cox, who more recent was indicted federally, and then the state charges. And his case is weird because Wikipedia says that guy gets out in 2023, but everything that I've done in my research says that because the state had lowered his sentence, he actually gets out in 2023. And
Huh.
so I think that guy gets out this year, but I don't know for
Oh shoot.
sure because it's not something I can really verify easily. But
I love I love stories like that, but they're fun to write about. Searching them. I don't know how your experience was putting together that story, but
it
you were
it
reminding me
was
of when I wrote. It's it's a lot of work, especially it probably means something to you because it's from high, high tension because of this guy's death.
Yeah, it was something I definitely cared a little more about than other things I've written about in the past, just because it's sort of in my political alley, my own like personal beliefs, but then also like I have a tendency, when I decided to make this story, uh and people often see me on Twitter rally against Max Blumenthal, who has been, I'll get to that in a second. But basically, uh they the media back in 2008, because John McCain ran for president and Sarah Palin was his running mate, which everybody who was alive, I think, during that time period understands that really what absolutely demolished McCain's campaign was Palin. It's the fact that he picked this person that wasn't even supported by Alaskans, let alone by a national audience who like just saw her as a doofus. She basically got ruined by an SNL skit and a porno movie. I
She
mean,
did. They there's people. She said things that in fact, like they bought into the Sarah Palin outside that. I remember, and in retrospect, she's probably not bad as McCain. She still sucks.
oh,
Really.
she is
McCain's
horrible. Her
really
politics are
yeah
god awful. But
yeah.
she, back in the
That's fun.
day, she was not as bad. She had a period in the early 2000s where she was a member, not directly, but she attended the conventions and went to the Alaskan Independence Party meetings. She was very well
Okay.
known in that space.
Right.
And so what happened was when she was brought into his ticket in 2008 was the whole media class sort of brought back up that she was had these intimate ties to this fringe political party in the state of Alaska, and brought up these quotes from Joe Vogler, which he has, which are, by the way, some of my favorite parts of this guy. He has quotes like "My hatred for the federal government," or he was so he wasn't buried in the state of Alaska, even though he died here. He in his will demanded that he be buried in Dawson, Canada, and that his body be reburied in the state of Alaska when it becomes an independent nation. Like,
What?
so like that. These are
Let's
some of
go.
the things this guy.
Let's go. He went missing in New York. He was
So no,
found
he went missing in
in Alaska.
Alaska. So
Oh,
he went
okay.
missing. What happened was
Okay.
this is before his trip was set to take place.
All right.
And
Gotcha.
originally the police sort of covered it as being a missing person. They argued that, he was older. At this point he was in his late 80s.
Right.
But he was
Right.
still doing speeches and political events and old nine yards. I mean, uh, and so, he was sort of known as, he's also a pretty gruff guy. This wasn't like your
Right.
perfect clean cut, this is a dude who carried a gun and was an Alaskan and grew up, you know, taking care of stuff in this area. So it's like the idea of this guy just walks off and wanders off is just sort of laughable if you know the state. So it's, when I was reading that that's what the police thought happened, I'm like, well, this doesn't really make a ton of sense. But because they were sort of seeing it as a missing person, just he walked off because he's old thing, and didn't realize later on that it was actually a murder, you end up with a situation where they didn't even look for a lot of things. Now, they did
Right.
note that they didn't find any signs of a struggle at the house. They found no blood. They found nothing in the yard. And it's like, well, then, if you didn't find any of this stuff, how is this guy supposed to be shot here and removed from here by this guy Manfred West, who's in jail for the crime still to this day? And
Wow.
he's a legit drug addict. This was a two-bit criminal who had
Right.
no knowledge of anything that would protect him from not getting caught. And
How how was he shot? How did they find
he was
the bullet
shot
holes?
once in the front and once in the back of the head.
You know which one happened first?
I believe the one in the front chest.
Huh.
From my
Weird.
understanding, the story that is told by Manfred West is that Vogler wanted to purchase plastic explosives from him, and so he went to his cabin, and then Vogler accused him of stealing from him and told him to leave the property, and that
Okay.
Vogler pulled a gun on him, and so he shot Vogler, and then Vogler ran and he shot him in the back of the head. The problem with that
Wow.
as a story is his story has him shooting Vogler twice in a yard, which the cops were at and would have seen there was no anything there. And his own neighbor, the guy who reported him missing, also went to that house and went there every day for, years. So it's like he'd notice if something was off. Vogler had
Wow.
dogs, and all of his dogs had been drugged. There was a private investigator who
Whoa.
wouldn't got testing done because the cops wouldn't at the time, and the cops wrote that off publicly by saying Vogler drugged his dogs because he was taking them to the vet. I'm like, I've never heard of me giving my dog, like, I don't,
Heard
that's not
that.
that's not really a thing that I've ever done or any Alaskans ever fucking heard of. So I dropped my
That's
earbuds back
crazy
there.
story.
But yeah, it's a wild sort of ride. I did about a 45-minute like YouTube video that breaks down sort of the whole story, and then I'm working now with some people to get a full sort of length reel like documentary done, because the one that I did is more of a, it's me talking with what I've written and then compiled some things together, and stuff that I can gather from archives and things. But what I'd like to really do is go over to Fairbanks, and talk to some of the people that are still around. Which, I mean, I've talked to a lot of them, but I mean more of on camera, and get some sort
Yep.
of footage and stuff. And his cabin, there's one of his cabins is still over there and things. So there's
Oh, yeah.
stuff that I could
Yeah.
go sort of maybe even film at locations like that and get some cool footage would be cool.
No, you
So
totally should.
I'm
I'm like way into.
mm, well I I've always been into stuff like that. When I googled Joe Vogler, back, this is years ago at this point, I searched the name Joe Vogler on YouTube, and the only thing that came up was this 30-second clip that led to a 4-minute clip that had been bot loaded onto the platform by hundreds of accounts. And what this clip was of um, Sarah Palin speaking to the AIP members at like a 2006 conference. And it all tied to a campaign that, from my understanding and what I've been able to find, was ran by Rachel Maddow's production team. And what it was doing was what I think a lot of people sort of now understand is happening all over the place, which was it was just flooding the search algorithm of YouTube with this clip. So anytime I would research past a certain point with any of the, search parameters of like in between these years and these years, if you run into those years, you just get flooded with this content. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Well, Max Blumenthal had traveled to the state of Alaska at one point and done a hit piece on with Salon.com on Sarah Palin. And in order to do this, he went and dug up all this horse crap on the AIP. In the process
Oh,
of that,
geez.
he wrote a lot of lies about sort of the legacy of Vogler, including like again like this tying them to Southern secessionist and these groups so that he could tie it into ADL crap. And it's like what was going on with it was you're like, well, this is nothing like that. And in my documentary I literally play an audio clip which was right there in a searchable archive he could have found even back then, which is of Joe Vogler himself speaking, the guy who founded the party, saying we're not secessionists. Like, we're not. Like, he's literally
It's
just saying that,
never enough.
like in those words. And it's like,
Yep.
yeah. So it's one of those things where in the video I play him on Rachel Maddow's show, and he's
Wow.
just spewing these lies over and over again, and I interlace it with the clips of Vogler's own
Oh, that's good.
words, sort of refuting it, and it's
Yeah.
like you could have went back and found this at any point. I mean, this archive's been there since like the mid '80s,
Yep.
so it's like it's just
That's
it's that stuff that irritates me. And then today, it's like now in the context that we're in, it's like I see him like running up on stage to confront Rachel Maddow while she's speaking, and it's like he's being accepted into all these other areas, and I'm like, this guy is like not really atoned for any of this stuff that he did. Like, we all know this guy did a lot
right.
of pretty evil stuff in the media world. Like, I don't
Yep.
like that very much, but I also get it. I mean,
That's how.
I understand the media angle of it, but it sucks.
But that's how it always goes. When I look at the corporate media people like Fox or CNN, reality that people buy. I heard a historian a long time, George Washington, spent his righting a lot of wrongs that people in the papers. So it's on forever, I think, where people know that their readers or their audience, knowing, we're the journalists is in some cases they should be, but role that by them being bended and twisted reality so much, you could see what they, the things that happen, like they took the thing so out of context, and people who are not plugged into the news, he said this and that, but he also said that article that told you that thing. You're only, so it's like, it's unfortunate, but it's ridiculous that happens all the time. And that the media, I don't want to say people are ignorant, and a lot of people don't go past the
Well, I think
viral
I don't think
video.
it's necessarily people being ignorant as much as it is that people see things and they take them at face value. And some people will see that as ignorance. I just see it as convenience. I see it as these people have become, media is viewed as this sort of, either you're interested in a story because you're investigating it and you want to know more about it, or you're interested in a story because you got it on a Google alert and you just saw a headline then scrolled past
this
it.
Is I think it's a lot of ignorance, though, and spectrum, because we live in an age so heavily invested about something. You can't just rely all those emotions. It's like you do have the into these things more. So it's like I get one family, right? Like when they're so about these feelings, whether it's DeSantis or Robert Kennedy Jr. Like, nah, you're just. But the laziness that's attached pisses me off so much. Where I'm the ability to search this shit,
I do agree that it is irritating, especially with Twitter. You see sort of the quick snap to judgment. I recently, to give you an idea, I watch a lot of random YouTubers. So one of them was this guy named Quite. Recently, like a few months back, this guy, and he's got a decent sized following, but there was like this cancel movement because somebody had come out with allegations about him. And the allegations were pretty messed up. Everybody on Twitter piles on, all these big creators come out and like publicly disown this guy having involvement with him. And then it comes out that not only had the person fabricated this stuff, but they had fabricated doctor's notes, and they had went to a point beyond anything that could be viewed as accidental. And so all of these people on Twitter, I'm going, every single one of you that doesn't have the ability to reach out to either one of these people, you're just seeing outward information. So I understand how you have these reactions in to some of the stuff. But a lot of the people who are doing this were people who did have the ability to reach out to either one of these people. And so it's like you decided to literally throw people under the bus simply because you don't have you don't have the drive to simply send a DM or send a text message or a phone call somebody's way.
Is it because
the stuff, and
just
so
wanna,
it's the same thing.
Is it because they just, or is it because they're afraid to ask them? I always wonder what that is when you do, because you see this happen in the media
Well, it's the same
all the time, or not.
It's likely, and I think it's it's the same drive as, somebody like Alex Jones, who, you mentioned you're going to be publishing an article about that. I'm somebody who has sort of a mixed bag opinion on him, because on one side of it, I've watched him for a while, like since I was probably 13 or so. So, I've seen the guy's stuff for a very long time, and I was a big fan of the sort of UFO radio like stuff before, other people sort of in the same vein as what he does. But I
Yep.
never viewed that stuff as being factual to a upteenth degree. My view on it was always like, this is a guy who's throwing around concepts. When I would listen to those old radio shows, it was the same way. It was
Right.
like, you'd have these guys who were calling in who were claiming to be from, working at Area 51. And clearly, a lot of those people aren't telling the truth, but there might be one or two of them in there that are, and that's the fun of it. Like, you
For
have to
sure.
sort of go through there and do that due diligence. And so I think a lot of people looked at him as being some like paradigm of truth, and I've never looked at him as that. I've always looked at
Right.
him as a alternative media personality, sort of the
Right.
same way I would in the very same way I'd look at somebody like Tim Pool in a way now, or look at you
Right.
know any other big podcaster, producer person who's built up maybe even their
Right.
own, like Louis J. Gomez is a comic, right? I'd put him in the same
Yep.
category because he's built up his own like platform and things like that. I
Yep.
think that's sort of what I have put him in the category of. Whereas I think there's a lot of people who go, well, no, either he is this truth seeker, truth teller always, or
Right.
he's this absolute monster. And I'm like, no, he's
No.
just a person.
Yeah.
like,
Think,
like,
um, you put a person who talks about concepts. A fair way of putting it. Look at him throughout the ages, and but it's, if you talk to him, he's like a prophet. It's just because he's been reading, all this shit. So pattern, and every now and then he's like, okay, 15, 20 years ago, I'm him. Recently, and now everyone, because he's been reading it and recognizing past. It's not like it was all stuff that was hidden. People knew about Epstein
right.
going to jail. He just happened to be one of the only people talking, make him look like a monster, monsterish. So, breaks, whether it's that or
and I think there's with Jones, I think you have sort of this, there's an entire business around writing and producing articles about him. It is very akin to the Trump media machine in the fact that you have this guy who's become so famous, so big in the psyche of the media and just the public's view, that you
Yep.
can make money off of doing this, and you can do that in a positive way. But the media doesn't make money off of
Yeah.
positive things, at least not the mainstream media. They make it off of clicks, and those are always going to be negative clicks, and so you get this
Yep.
uh, sort of waves of content that comes after people. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. It's not just Jones, it's anybody who goes up against that mainstream media sort of
Anybody.
headway, the cathedral, or whatever you want to refer to it as. It's like, this is,
Yep.
if you step up against that system, you just get vaporized, typically.
Yep.
And that's not a new thing. Everybody thinks that's something new, and I'm like, no, man. Like, I've read enough history books that it's like, this stuff's been going on like since my grandmother was a kid. Like,
Oh,
so
dude.
it's crazy.
I think this is ancient. This is just human. When anyone questions the
Yeah.
authority, like, people will, digitally these days or whatever, to agree with everything Alex says or does. There's plenty of things I'm like, man. But I appreciate that he is willing to question anything, or see that you can do that. And I don't, I don't ever really get offended, or someone gets offended, then just turn to listen to it. Like, it has nothing, has really, people say, oh, words are violence is violence. Just let the people talk. In my opinion, what they've done, I think he's probably can't really, his, it's, I mean, his people who are like, he still has a show, like 3 hours a day. And you're like, really, and he's certainly suffered participate in the digital space. However, I think somehow through it all, whether it's a strike, if you're out in public with him, it's crazy. It's like you use very polarizing, but in real people seeing him, it's really interesting to like observe that between the online world and the real world.
Yeah, it seems to me that the separation of like, I mean, I think it's one of those things where you talk about like there are very few people who could walk through the center of a big city and just gather a crowd, right? Like there's not really, there are celebrities and then there's like these people who've sort of gotten into the zeitgeist of like cultural thought. And he's certainly one of them. You sort of have to put Trump in that same regard, even though I think, in the same way, there's like, I have different contentions with Trump over than
Oh
somebody
yeah.
like Alex Jones, because Trump was actually in charge
Oh
of
yeah.
the fucking country. It's like Alex Jones
Yeah.
ultimately doesn't affect many people's lives. That's the reality. Like,
Right.
um, and there's sort of this debate now being had. I think, the iDubbbz drama and stuff like that happened on the internet recently has brought that debate back up of like, well, are these content creators responsible for their fans and how much of this stuff do they have on their shoulders? It's like zero, none. Like
Yeah.
the idea that somebody who is making content as a individual or a group of people, regardless of what it is, if their message is not directly calling for you to go do a thing, then they're not telling you to
Right.
do that thing. How you interpret their content is how you interpret it. And so
That's
you have this sort of
exactly how I feel.
movement of people being like, no, you have to, if you say something that we can guide under the notions of you being uh, having bad intentions, then automatically we can cancel you. And it's just the new arm of
Right.
that movement trying to sort of,
Yep.
I think it's the dying breath of that cancel culture sort of mentality, which I see just dying everywhere. I mean, anybody who's
Yep.
in I watch a lot of YouTubers, and it's like that was, in my opinion, the best area to see this stuff happening in real time, because not political content, not the news media content. I'm actually talking about things like I watch gaming YouTubers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as instead of like Family Guy, like
Right.
when I was younger, that's what I watched. So I didn't have like TV. I would go download a bunch of YouTube videos and then go home and watch them because I lived in the middle of the
Right.
woods, so it wasn't like, and that was just sort of I got used to. So now that I'm older, it's
Yep.
like when I'm bored in the background, I'll put on gaming YouTube videos and go cook or do whatever I'm doing. And
Right.
a lot of the content creators I watched had to censor their content, had to change the way they were doing things, change the way they were speaking. And you could tell, and they would talk about it on their own private channels and things like that. And then recently, in the last year and a half, I've seen most of those guys just throw that out the window. Because even if they're
Right.
not getting monetized, they can get sponsorships and get their own private stuff. And what I think the
Yep.
mistake that was made by the establishment that sort of pushed this on everybody
Yep.
is all they did was force all these independent content creators to learn how to do this stuff themselves. And now you've created a bunch of people who are even more independent and are even more equipped to go up against what you're doing. So you're going to see rival advertising companies popping up and people who are pushing sort of new narratives. And once they lose that grip of this advertising wing, which is the whole monetary system that goes behind a lot of the media, it's like then
Yep.
you start losing a lot of ground and you lose it very quick. So that's sort of what I think is the positive, like the white pill perspective on how things could play out.
I'm with
The
you.
other way is that that just doesn't happen at all, and it's just all doomed.
No, no, no. You're right. It happened though. I mean, the people in it, system, the system, the old system, the establishment rejected them, or it was gate have to say certain things. So the past few years, especially in COVID, because then everyone was the establishment kind of clamped, say. So then the independent people are not. It kind of flourished. That is that's how I feel. I'm trying to say this, like this whole economy or whatever. It's uh, it's going to be interesting to see how the establishment of old, like they're very desperate, and I
Yeah,
hate to even,
there's
but let me just say this real quick, like tuitions at some point they will probably find some steam and starts to falter because it's going to happen. Every like I look at New York City, and I think I lived in New York for a long time. And it's died. I obviously it's different, but I see that balance. So I see a lot of with everything independent. I want to see the establishment completely collapse. Shouldn't forget about it because it will rear its ugly head at some point.
well, I think there's this sort of mentality too I see with with the right and left sort of structure and every way that politics operates too, where it has a way of like um everybody sort of takes up a battle from their political lines, and then you end up with this situation where you don't realize that those lines shift constantly. And so you have these guys, I
Oh,
think, where that shows most evidently is you have people like Bill Maher, you have people like Tim Pool for that matter, or individuals like that who were sort of
yeah,
in one political wing, and you have this whole system that shifts around them.
yep.
And so if you don't have this constant ability of sort of readdressing the points that those positions force you into, and looking into what everybody else in your wing of politics are sort of taking the account of, then you lose your ability to have any understanding of what your actual political beliefs are, and you become what I think in the modern world we'd refer to as an NPC, or
Yeah,
sort of just uh,
it's easy to
and
fall
I
into
think that's
that
what's
trap.
happened to a lot of people. A lot of people were in this position of I'm an Obama Democrat and I voted for this guy and this is my political class, and you had a bunch of people who were like I'm a George W. Bush Republican and this is my opinion. And then the parties moved around them, and a bunch of like 70 to 90% of them were just left standing there with their dicks in their hands going, "What's up?"
Seriously.
like
Oh, dude, it's like I knew people growing up who I thought of as conservative. I see today's conservative as liberal, but then I see the leftist, the conservatives that I knew growing up is like, but they think centrists are far right. It's confusing for people. It, it, it's terrible. But yeah, they keep changing the definition. So what you were yesterday.
Yeah, I feel like one of the few, I consider myself to be sort of ANCAP libertarian, sort of in the side of that stuff, the Misesian economics and free market stuff. But it's like as an observer of the political system, I'm not really big on national politics as much as I am on local stuff, because
Oh
I think the
yeah,
national stuff just more and more to me is like none of this matters. Like
not at
the
all.
same decisions are getting made no matter who's in power. And so
Mm-hmm.
really what this just instigates is everybody to have animosity towards everybody. And you end
Yep.
up creating this system where like people who are my age hate each other based on who they voted for. And I'm like, what?
Oh yeah.
This is
Yeah.
stupid. Like, I mean, I'll debate your points, but like, I didn't it seems completely culture destroying over time to
Yep.
operate a society like that. And I think we're seeing sort of now the repercussions of it. I think we're going to continue to see it. I'm really sort of anticipating this 2024 um, shit show because that's what it's going to be, and there's no way to stop it from being that. I think that's what a lot of
No.
people, and everybody's accepted that it's going to be that. It's not like there's a media platform that's like, everybody, we just need to calm down and come to our. It's like, no, we're all running towards the cliff full speed, and whoever gets off the end first does it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I mean, and I was, I don't know why, I'm some kind of like political politics, so just like watching it. And so I remember general seasons happened, and then and then they would just stop, and feel like and it would, you know, for back to election season. I feel like we've been in season since 2014, and it's like being on heroin your brain every day, and on deranged,
well,
because it's
I
like,
think the media made money off of those clicks. And it's just what we were talking about previously. It created this
yeah,
generator that no one's been able to shut off. And so it's
yeah,
just running until the fucking gas tank's empty.
right. Now they're saying, NASA's warning, so it goes away. Maybe it will be better for it. Who knows? Fake aliens. So I'm not so.
Yeah. I uploaded an edit I did a few days ago. It got like I feel like some of my my video posts on Twitter get sort of black holed, but it was an edit I did on uh, the the spaceship sightings from Alaska back in the 70s and 90s. But it's one of those things where the alien stuff is something I have a sort of mixed bag opinion on, because I'm looking at all this stuff that's happening now today, and I'm going, well, you had this guy who's a whistleblower, but he's also like works for the government, so you can't really trust a damn thing he's saying at the same time. So it's like this
Right,
double-edged sword.
right.
And then you've got media that everybody's sort of attitude was weird, because I saw a bunch of people being like, well, we know this guy is bogus because the media picked the story up in the first place. I'm like, not really, though, because this was covered by like
Debrief.
News Nation or something like that, which I don't. They're not really what I would call a household name media company. And then I saw like 2 stories, 3 stories by like Fox, CNN type, coverage, and then that was it. And so I was like,
Right,
well,
right.
this guy could be for real. I listened to what was out there of it, and I'm like, yeah, it is what it is. I mean, you can't really. The problem with all of this stuff is there's never any like, hey, I have this fucking legit thing in my
Yeah,
hand that'll here,
yeah.
let me show you this.
I
And
want
so
to
I end up
see the
doing.
whistle. I want to see the whistle blow onto camera. That first article was in like the debris I heard of until and then yeah, little places picked it up, and then the more corporate places. So it was like the typically happened. But I was one of those people who heard that he was a well vetted. Nah, I'm good. I'm not going to completely write it off. A little too for me. And then in those daily after the whistleblower story, there were Las Vegas thing was happening. That they
I saw that,
crashed
which that whole thing
in
seems
Vegas.
like horseshit. I watched that video, and
Totally.
it's like, what are you? There's like these guys going like, no, look, there's this thing behind this tractor, guys. It's totally there, and I'm like, no,
Right.
there's not.
So
Like,
there were like there were three the cops who said it's like the most believable, because it was kind of like they were like there was in their emotions which seemed genuine. People and being like, "Did you see something?" And a few people had or whatever. So I was like, "Okay, that happened." But I don't know what was the one I think you're talking about where they were in the
That was, I think
tractor.
that was different then. I know
Oh,
there's one
it
I've
was
seen
totally
where
different.
there was police footage, and then there's another one I've seen where they're like coming out of a gate in like somebody's back,
Okay,
like
I thought that was
somebody's
still
household neighborhood.
was that Vegas? Because then there was that third one of like behind
Oh,
the
okay. I
and
haven't seen that
it
one
was
maybe,
really
but yeah,
bad.
there's a bunch of like, you know, over here, the one that gets talked about, it was a flight in Japan, Japan Airways, and
Okay.
they were coming from Canada. They had a stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. While they were flying, they reported to the airways that there was a craft that was, I mean, the size of a fucking, like they were describing the size of a stadium, like a carrier
Oh wow.
jet,
Okay.
sized craft was flying above them and in front of them at one point, and had these huge thrusters on it. I mean, they're describing a legit, what sounds like an actual craft, like what you would think something like that would look like. And where they're flying through is an area in Alaska where the government had a lot of military activity and stuff. So, I think a lot of people go, well, it's a military thing, but I'm like, no, I don't think, like, the guy who's flying a 747, so he knows how big a 747 is. So if he's
Right.
looking out at something that's a lot bigger than a 747, that thing's big. So
Yeah.
it's like,
That's
and
that's
it's one of those stories where you have this air captain, this pilot who's like, no, I mean, we saw this. There were other people on the plane who saw it. You have all these witness testimony, and the way it gets written off today in the modern era is like, well, all of these people had some kind of shared psychosis, and they all sort of just saw the same thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's
interesting.
not a good
Yeah.
explanation for this. Like,
That that to me is that's a ridiculous. I go back and forth with all this because the faux report came out like 2 years ago. Congressional hearing about and in that report did happen to take cases. So, so then two different ways. Okay, is that the military just happened to see something like the people you're saying? I think I don't know if it's military or not. Into the more extraterrestrials have chosen military crazy bullshit for
right.
creating the
Well, there's a
answer.
there's a real world, like the real world explanation stuff that and I've gone down those rabbit holes and sort of tried to go, okay, how could you explain this with like the science angle of it? And I understand some of that stuff because I used to be interested in physics and stuff as a kid, and so there's a
Cool.
lot of the stuff I'm looking at and going, okay, this is interesting. But there is this there was a scientist, there's a Chinese woman named Ming Li, who there's a documentary about her, but she passed away um fairly recently, and she was older, in a retirement community thing, but um she created it back in the it was the 80s or 90s. She created what she claimed was a spinning conductor that created a magnet field, sort of in the way that you would think of, like, not anti-gravity but a new gravitational field, sort of this way to harness a new gravitational field. And she had patented all these devices, and she had these peer-reviewed articles that she had published and things, and she went to work with like the Justice Department and National Boeing at one point, and some pretty big, like, companies and private defense researchers, people like that. Creates her own company, gets a bunch of investors and things, and then she just disappears. And she what most scientists who've been sort of on camera and have talked about her have said is that she probably ended up going back to China.
Hmm.
Um, but when you look into some of what she had um, was trying to create and what the devices were supposed to have done, it is very reminiscent of the quote tic tacs that everybody keeps seeing. The way that they
Yeah.
move is very
Right.
this perpendicular sort of just flash movements where it almost seems like they're being kind of pulled in a direction by something very fast. That's sort of what her whole design structure around this gravitational field using these conductors was supposed to be like. And
Huh.
so I've heard a lot of people say, in a lot of areas on the internet when I was digging into it, and some of it does make sense where they're like, well, maybe this girl or some other scientist like her developed some of this stuff and it did legitimately get used by certain governments, whether that be the US or China or,
Right.
Europe, some European country, Russia, whoever. But at the same time, right, you have to go. At some point, somebody's going to shoot one of these down. Somebody's going to have one. There's sightings of these going back a very long time.
Hmm.
Where are they? And you've got these videos, but all these videos are connected to the fucking Navy. They're connected to government again. And so it's like, yeah, it's very easy for the government to have an Air Force guy come out and say, I was in my plane and I saw this little thing in front of me, and look at this video I have of this balloon in the center of my. And it's like,
Right.
yeah, that's not hard to fake if you're doing it on purpose.
It could be.
Which is,
It could be even more than that. Though. It's like they don't even have to prop up the guy and say, but it's like if they're testing, I think they see something, and then these guys opt into thinking like, no, oh yeah, they're not even a part of the greater on. But
well, and I mean
they're
the government has done that before with
yeah.
they've simulated to people events that they thought they were actually doing. This was something that was done commonly, and I know a lot of people bring this up in context of the space missions, but that's something that was done commonly in that field. They would run
Mm-hmm.
simulations where they would convince these people that they were actually doing these things because they wanted to see the psychological effects that it had on the people.
Yep.
And so they have a literal guidebook on this. Like they've already tested these
Right.
ideas, The
Yep.
the the whole psychological manipulation thing. It's like, well, that's what the government's done the most studying on. You go back to the 50s, they were spending
It's
millions
their
of
favorite
dollars doing it. They
thing.
got caught doing a lot of that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Midnight climax. They love dose
Well,
and
my
and fucking
grandmother,
with their brains.
you talked about how much New York had changed and some of
Mm-hmm.
the changes and how it had changed over and over again and kind of had those, my grandfather um, moved to New York, and my grandmother had, or not New York, but California rather, and he had been in Chicago before that and had family over there, and came to California, and he was a magician and did like set design and acting over there in California and stuff, and he's still over there. He's just in his late 80s. He's living it up in Montebello.
Wow.
Um,
Sweet.
but he raced bikes, and he was a member of he created a thing called the Cycle Nights over there, which was a like biker meetup club and that whole thing, and this is back in the day, and I've my grandmother was in the paper over in California with my dad when he's like a little baby, and she's got him like in her lap on the seat of a bike, like like that was just how
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
rode around California back then. And the culture there was sort of that hippie, the 60s, 70s culture that had sort of moved into that area. And my grandfather and my grandmother are perfect examples of, my grandmother worked, and I'm allowed to talk about this stuff because it's all out of, but this is sort of the story of my grandmother was, she realized very early on with the banking system and checks that it was very easily fooled. and so she took some money, and she traveled around to other states doing the same thing. And you know, through that process, of course, she became wanted in a few places, and the statutes of
Whoa.
limitation run out and stuff, and in that process changed, you know, changed the way that she was living, changed the way she looked and things like that, and had to go through that whole process.
Right.
And that's a lot of people end up in Alaska that way and stuff. But um, she you know, she worked for the federal government after that. She
Wow.
was she was in charge of the mail on the J Bear base in Anchorage, Alaska, on the
Wow.
biggest military base here, um, around nuclear silos and reactors and planes and the whole 9 yards. I mean, I went on base all the time and went and go to air shows and crap and go meet up with go have lunches and things. And um,
Wow.
so when I got older and you sort of get to talk to people about this stuff, you realize how much of this is like fragile, because here's somebody who like had a past, right? And was
Mm-hmm.
able to go just sign on a dotted line and go work for the federal government and get a paycheck, and like yet no one was the wiser. No one, like, there was nobody there to go, hey, you popped up in our system as being a thing. So what that tells you, what it told me at a very young age, is like this whole like idea of like, they're gonna catch everybody, and it's like this system of like they're the omnipotent government that has all the power, and that's like their it just never really took to me. I was like, this doesn't really,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
my grandfather was in the military, and I had family members who worked for, as engineers for bigger, manufacturing companies and things that were connected to the government. And every one of them
Right.
had stories of incompetence and and
Yep.
inaccuracies and just insane stories of how horrible these systems were. And then
Oh
my
yeah.
grandfather.
I think I was just
Oh,
say I think a lot of the government built. Whitney well the government being basically so the mob and the mob, but they will also deal with criminals on all types of levels. A lot of them see something in them because they have, yeah, okay, it's crime out, but they'll be like, we're going to take advantage of that because your brain is working on different. There's bad criminals, there's good criminals. It's also the ones that you know in Operation Paperclip to
well,
hire
there's literal
wild
prisons
people.
today that the
Yeah,
government admits are operated specifically to put people that they consider to have gifts or different, sort of, people they want to use.
yeah, yep. But you were going to say,
Mm. My grandfather, the one in California, doing the work he did and stuff, and he's watched, the culture in California completely shift from this
mm,
hippie sort of like, the peace love era, which he, wasn't even specifically into. He was an old Jewish guy. It wasn't really his big
right,
interest. He was an economics sort of financial dude, and that's just what it was. And he, his sort of way of understanding things was interesting because I got to talk to him, about 5, 6 years ago, and one of the things I talked to him about was how much California changed from those days and how things had gone. And
mm,
one of the things he brought up in the middle of the conversation was how much, like, he talked about the fact that, you know, there were all these music groups that came into California, and like, they brought in drugs and things, and the bike groups that were there and things were fully aware that a lot of those concerts and things were orchestrated by government officials, were put on by government people who wanted to have sort of a testing ground. Um, and now I'm older and I get to research that stuff, and I'm like, oh, he was like, no, this is real. Like,
Yeah.
Like, you look at things like the Grateful Dead, and you look at what some of those bandmates have actually said on record, and some of the research have been done by other people into that stuff, and you go, oh, like, this is very likely like a front so that you could basically do what they were doing with MK Ultra, do what they were doing with all these programs, but do it on a mass scale, right? Like, imagine if you have,
Yes.
30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people in an open air environment, and none of them know what's going to have happened to them the next day.
Exactly.
It's like,
Oh,
you have
I
this
dude,
freedom to just mess with whatever you want.
I think those early ones and the midnight climax stuff that obviously started to, the culture, the hip back then, but it's blossomed as, I think social media manipulates everyone's brains. You could possibly do to a just or outdoor event with, and for sure they're dosing and whatnot, studying. Imagine what that however many years ago. What are we doing today? How much has it changed? I think about this
Yeah.
ski experiment, our own government experiment on watch them suffer. So it them, I think, just grows and grows and grows to
Well, I
whatever
mean,
they're building that people are
to
they're
take
doing
it
with us.
to to take it to a context in my Alaskan perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the Japanese and most people forget that there was any battles on U.S. soil. That whole thing gets debated back and forth, but there was. The Battle of Attu here in Alaska was on the Aleutian Islands here, and there were natives that lived there at the time. It was Alaskan native villages that were there. Um, the U.S. government, right? They go around, round up all these Japanese people throughout the U.S. and put them into to prisoner camps for the time being. Well, they did the same thing with all the Alaskan natives, and a very large portion of them died as a result of this. The United States government, um, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, these types of organizations that filled those voids in the state, caused the destruction of what is now like probably 40% of the native population in the state.
Mm.
And it happened because of a culling of all of the people who were actually working. I mean, they went into these village environments and said, no, we're going to take all of you and take you to a new location that you've never been to. We're going to assign you jobs and sort of put you in these uniforms, and we're going to give you medical attention that isn't what you're used to. A lot of
Yep.
people don't talk about this either, but when you had all the miners come into the state of Alaska, which is a natural thing that was going to happen no matter what. The government had no involvement in that. Well, the natives were able to sort of bounce back from that because they at the time had the ability to cure things like tuberculosis. They had natural remedies for tuberculosis. This was very well documented as being the case. And, when the population came to be higher in the state of Alaska, they stopped being able to sort of handle the amount of cases that they were getting through their natural medicine. And so by the time this happens, the government comes through, they take all these people, put them in the camps, and a lot of them died from TB because the
Wow.
government didn't have a way of treating it, right? So just a few years ago, I'm researching all this stuff and sort of looking into it, and I find a story from the governor of Alaska in 1999, Tony Knowles. Tony Knowles sends a message to the federal government saying, hey, we just discovered a bunch of bodies, and we need to know why the hell they're here. And what it
Mm.
turns out had happened is the federal government, while they were doing all this stuff with these work camps and the camps that they had put these people in the medical community, well, a lot of the people they were getting were kids. And so they took one of the World War II bunkers that had been decommissioned here in Alaska and filled it with the bodies of a bunch of native children and just filled the thing over with cement. And
Good.
Tony Knowles in the 90s, trying to build an airport, found these bodies because they excavated, like they were going to tear down that area and repave over it. And they didn't mark those graves, so most of them were never identified. The families were never notified that their family members had died, so most of them had assumed they had gone missing. And so you end up with this, like, that's the kind of shit the government's willing to do. And that didn't happen
Oh
because of
yeah.
a clerical error. Like, that was
Right.
done because somebody decided to sign on a dotted line and okay it. The same way that Waco and those kind of events, like, it all comes down to somebody had to sit there and go, yes, I'm
Yeah.
okay with this happening.
Dude, when I was the earlier about that I was writing, I ended up doing specific Civil War research, and because it was General Sherman's March to the Sea, and I grew up right near West Point, which most of the generals on both sides of General Sherman, won the war, which they kind of venerate him to be this hero, and then obviously no one can be a pure hero. Past that thought about him in this book, and I saw that he approved like the mass that were following the March to the Sea, and he hated them. So they shot them, women, children, and
It was grotesque.
it was,
I read about that
oh my God.
when I was about
Yeah.
16 or 17. I read a book about um I can't remember what the book was now. It was from a like author who was from New York. He was and he was sort of writing from a perspective of somebody who had the different opinion sort of thing going into it.
Right.
But it was amazing to read some of the stuff because I'm like the like the scorched earth policy and sort of this idea of like I'm just going to just destroy everything in my path. And it's like
Everything.
just complete brutality, and you're like,
Oh
how
man.
is this, like, from any perspective of a modern sense, like, how
Right.
can you justify this, let alone if you were in the time period? Because if when you go back and you start reading some of the personal opinions of people of that time period as a reaction to what he had done, it's
Right.
clear that it was a problem then. So it's like,
Oh yeah.
this wasn't accepted then, let alone now.
uh,
So,
he really wanted to create hell on earth. It was America's first atom bomb. Same thing. We're just totally destroying thing, and he did. Fucked up. Like, and the town they weren't directly affected by the march. A lot of people took advantage of the march, did their own marauding. They'd be
oh, well,
there.
yeah, because this guy says
We're
it's
gonna
okay,
do
right?
that.
And there's not going to be
Well,
repercussions because they're going to win. So I might as well,
exactly.
And by the way,
Rape
that's
and
the same
pillage.
mentality
And,
that we see happening in New York City today, right? It's the same reason why you'll see a bunch of people go raid a building and then 100 people were running after them. It's that same mentality. Uh,
yep.
and
It's nothing.
it leads to destruction. It always leads to destruction. It's leading
Yep.
to it now, and it led to it then. It's the same thing.
Yep. Oh, it's crazy. So
It's
sad.
that history repeats itself problem that never really seems to get solved. Is sort of that and that's why when I see everybody talk about Civil War stuff now, and I do, I am hesitant to say that's anything we're moving like direct. I'll rephrase that. We are moving directly towards that. I don't think that it's something that's going to happen in the immediate future, and the reasoning behind that
Right.
is just because there's a strife that happened during the Civil War that has yet to happen here in this
Yeah.
context, which is the physical aspect of it. And I think
Right.
that's sort of what people talk about in a lot of the libertarian spaces back a few
Yeah.
years ago. There was like the
I could go.
Boogaloo movement, right? The guys who
Yeah.
were like, we're gonna have this civil war, and if it happens, people need to be prepared, and this whole attitude about it. And my whole thing was always, as an Alaskan over here, right, separated from the rest of the U.S., sort of off to the side, but technically considered a northern state, right? I mean, because of our location, it's like, but our politics are definitely not of that, and you'll find a lot more people here who will defend that of the southern tribe as involvement in the Civil War than you'll
Right.
find just about anywhere else, because you've got a lot of people up here who are of that sort of mentality. So you don't.
Right.
I think people miss that the majority of the U.S. is not necessarily made up of those large cities,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's a lot of these places that no one thinks about with gigantic populations that have control of their lands that are like,
Yeah.
if this shit like comes to it, like they're going to be the ones that are way more likely to throw down a gauntlet than those areas like California, Seattle,
Yeah.
New York, these states where everybody sort of brings this stuff up. It's why I've
Yeah.
always said Texas is like, there's never going to be an actual secession movement that's successful in Texas. Again, it will start somewhere else. It'll have to be from, Florida, or, a place like that that hasn't been in the fray, or, Alaska or something like that that's off the wall to really sort of kick that whole field off. And then that doesn't
Yeah.
lead to a civil war. Everybody sort of gets that wrong. It's like, no, that's the trigger point where now everybody
I,
has to
I think.
decide, are we going to do this feasibly and peacefully, or is this going to be a
Yeah.
problem? Like,
I I think the thing about saying civil war, you define war now, right? Like I think we've been
exactly.
at war, I fucking decades, and but people are defining it as such. You see the way people. I think people are now. I'm not saying everybody, but like I mean, like you just go talk to people in dimensions as if there's a war taking, refusing to say, and it's also trench warfare. You look at continuously is shifting in modern age, where it's like this technological warfare, you know. So it's like I don't know how to define it. People say civil war and our civil war as like what we're expecting, but it's you look at the George Floyd riots. You look at there are people getting burnt, and think of civil war, but it's still political violence, probably fabricated by nefarious. But there's
Right.
also people who are truly happening. So
Yeah, it's sort of that mixed bag where it from the outsider's perspective, you almost have to just sort of wait and see. And I think that's what sort of puts everybody in this almost
Yep.
skittish way of approaching this, because I think a lot of people see the writing on the wall. You're like, well, these are political issues that aren't really ever going to get solved. Like the left and the right at this point is so opposed to each other that there is no real middle. And so you're left with
No.
either you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're an independent who just decides willy nilly, or you're a libertarian sort of somewhere who, which to me is sort of representing at this point the people who've caught on to like, hey, this is a bit weird. Like all this stuff is, and that's, but I really don't think it has anything to do with political branding at this point. I think that's the problem. It's like, I think what we've moved into now is it's like, no, we need people with ideas to solve this. And the way you
Yeah.
find that is not through Republican ideas or Libertarian ideas or Democrat
Right.
ideas. It's through ideas. You don't need this prescription of a label, which has really only been pushed on people because of the people who want you to be fighting anyway. And
No,
so
I
it's
agree.
like, you know,
I, I agree. Problem is, and I don't know how we come back to these ideas. Even good
yeah,
was like that sounds like such and such, and then Republicans or Democrats or libertarians, they're completely fractured. Everything is
yeah.
fractured the more you look at it. And honestly, I keep I keep hope because I think it's sometimes like ridiculous. Maybe it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like with you look at cities and whatnot in my lifetime, but I think my future, that's all I can hope for. Everything's politicized. That tragedy politicized, everything. So it's like that. That's why I keep thinking people are. We're just going to see probably go into and live in the other part of the country, live in the real, slowly drift apart. But I don't really want that either because that, also.
Well, I think the other thing that we see happening too is like we're watching the sort of natural migration on political means. And that's something that hasn't
Mm-hmm.
happened in the US in a very long time in general, so it's
Yeah.
sort of um it's interesting to see how that all plays out, and then over the next like 5 years how that sort of adapts these places. I think it's going to have an interesting effect. I think it's going to crystallize a lot of areas as being whatever faction politically they um, were going to lean
Mm-hmm.
to. So you have areas like that are going to tip as a result of it and things like that. But you have this sort of idea of like an easy breakup, which I just don't think is ever a possibility. I don't think there's any world in which, at least not the one that I see today, that has these countries sort of amicably separate without the political turmoil, without the drama that goes along
Oh
with
God.
it. And the question becomes is how much of that drama do you get? When do you get it? And for me
Right.
it's like, yeah, I don't see this as being the number one issue right now. It's like, there's
Mm-hmm.
other things that we have to solve, including how to even address the problems that we have as a result of the turmoil, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's no
Mm-hmm.
political faction today that is out there going, "Hey, we can solve this by like removing these systems, removing the ability for this to happen again." They're all just talking
Right.
about how to use the tools that are already in place, and it's like that's dangerous because
Oh yeah.
the precedent we've set already is not good. um,
Yeah.
well,
Well, I'm interested. I was just gonna say real quick. I'm interested in Canada, the CIA, the FBI. I don't know, it, but I'm also afraid that those agencies who truly like what happens to them when they're out of a job, or do they just become
that's
terrorists?
a
You
very
know?
good question that I don't think the U.S. was ever supposed to have to answer, but it does have
No.
to answer now, where we have
Yeah.
this system, right? So like everybody's talking about that in the context of Trump, because Trump comes out and says, they dump the swamp and stuff if you get reelected, and it's like, okay, but let's say you do. Let's say you become president again in 2024. Let's say
Right.
you don't bitch out again, and let's say you actually do go through with a lot of these things.
Right.
What then? What actually happens? And the real answer is nobody fucking has any idea. Uh,
Nobody
you know,
knows.
9/11 I think flipped a lot of this stuff on its head, because after that you had this public assertion of power from the government that
Yeah.
no one had ever really seen before. And now you have that locked in place, in which how do you even take it away from them? Like that's
Yep.
not it's and what happens when those people are, again, like you said, out of the job? Are they going to does that result in a new era of, American terrorism that is much more centralized around, these people popping up, or, attacks happening because
And
there's sort of this dying class
yeah,
warfare in a way.
and and I want to say like that might sound crazy to some people. You were saying that part, like Italy experienced years of literally just domestic terrorism
Yeah.
back and doing. We were the countries helping it out, but it's like that in reality. So, and then the other thing you hear people say, "Oh, we're going to clean it up. We're going to," like, okay, that's dope, but like he did clean up New York City, but what a lot he just put a lot of homeless people in, and he shipped them out up to where I live, like an hour and a half north, and then a lot of people who are living on the streets in the city. But then now we had new problems. Is that what you're going
So
to do?
it doesn't solve
I don't
anything,
know.
and in most cases, it's just pushing it around and just pushing these issues back onto other regions of the world. And it's like none of this stuff is actually solving any problems. And in a big way, that's what the whole military-industrial complex does. Is it just starts these conflicts and starts up these wars, and then it just sits
Yep.
back and loves the chaos. It revels in it because
They
it
make
allows them to make more money,
money.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
you're getting paid through all
exactly.
that chaotic stuff.
Making it
Well,
rain.
I typically keep the shows around an hour and a half, so if we want to close out, that's good. And
Awesome,
obviously
yeah, man.
you can be found on Twitter at Shane Cashman, correct? You
Yes,
have like
sir.
the best because it's just your name. That's perfect.
That's it.
So at Shane
Thank you.
Cashman on Twitter, I did put that in the description, everything, and then you've got a link tree there. You can find all your other stuff. And then you said you were releasing that Alex Jones article. Was it tomorrow?
Yeah, it should be out tomorrow. What's Thursday? Tomorrow.
Okay.
That's at
Well,
timcast.com.
I'm definitely gonna read that. Yes,
Yeah, it's a
timcast.com.
fun one.
Absolutely, can't forget that one. And I'm definitely gonna read that when it drops because that'll be cool.
Sick.
And yeah, well, I'd
Thanks,
love to
man.
get you back on sometimes too. We'll have to talk to. This was awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
man.
thanks everybody for hanging out, and we will talk to you guys in the next one.